They were forged in Alabama, but their destiny waited across an ocean. After years of doubt, suspicion, and sabotage, the Red Tails were finally, and the skies of Europe would never be the same. By late 1943, the Tuskegee Airmen were no longer an experiment. They were a weapon waiting to be tested. The Mediterranean skies roared with German fighters, and Allied bombers suffered catastrophic losses. The call went out for escorts who could fight with precision, discipline, and unbreakable unity. When the Red Tails took to the air, they didn't just enter the war, they entered history. From the beaches of Italy to the skies over Austria, every mission became a battle not only against the Luftwaffe, but against every doubt the world had ever placed upon them. Though the Tuskegee Airmen themselves had departed from the world, something extraordinary began to happen in the years after their passing. Their story acquired a second life. It was no longer bound to the fragile vessels of memory, it became an inheritance carried by a nation that finally understood its weight. And as this second life unfolded, the airmen's legacy stretched in directions they themselves could not have imagined when they first stepped onto the dusty training fields of Alabama. One of the most striking developments was the revival of historical research into their mission. Younger scholars, many of them pilots themselves, dug deep into military archives, retrieving mission reports, after-action reviews, flight rosters, and personal diaries that had gathered dust for decades. As these documents resurfaced, they revealed layers of detail that enriched the narrative in profound ways. Flight formations reconstructed from handwritten log, weather reports showing the brutal conditions pilots endured at 30,000 feet, correspondence between commanders debating strategy and praising performance, ground crew notes describing maintenance miracles performed overnight to keep Mustangs in the sky. Even the smallest details, fuel loads, ammunition count, altitude calculations scrawled in the margins gave depth and texture to the understanding of what the Red Tails had truly accomplished. It was as though history itself, dormant for years, had awakened and decided it was time to tell the full story. And with each discovery, the legend grew sharper, more vivid, more alive. But archives alone couldn't carry the narrative forward. What truly propelled the Tuskegee Airmen into the future were the people who refused to let their story fade: teachers, pilots, veterans, enthusiasts, filmmakers, and ordinary citizens who felt compelled to protect the legacy like a sacred flame. In classroom, teachers designed entire units around the airmen's journey. Students read letters written from air bases in Italy or studied mission maps showing how the 332nd Fighter Group escorted bombers across the Alps. Some schools launched model airplane projects where children constructed red-tailed Mustangs from balsa wood or cardboard, learning not just about aerodynamics but about perseverance. In these lessons, the airmen became more than historical figures, they became role models. Their courage became a lesson in responsibility. Their discipline became a lesson in self-control. Their triumph became a lesson in possibility. One teacher in Georgia, whose grandfather had served in the 477th Bombardment Group, put it this way: they teach history with their story, but they teach character with their example. Aviation communities carried the torch as well. Modern pilots often speak of heritage flight, honoring veterans by flying old warbirds alongside cutting-edge jets. In some of these flights, a red-tailed P-51 would take its place beside an F-2 Raptor or an F-35 Lightning II, the past and future of American airpower soaring together. Crowds at airshows would watch in awe as these machines performed slow passes in formation, the sleek lines of the P-51 beside the angular silhouette of a fifth-generation fighter. It was a visual reminder that every advancement in aviation had roots anchored in the bravery of those who flew before. For many spectators, the sight stirred emotion. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders. Veterans stood at attention. Some wiped tears from their eyes as the P-51's Merlin engine roared, echoing across the sky like a heartbeat from another time. And somewhere among the crowd, there was always someone who whispered, "Red Tails." Even beyond aviation circles, the airmen's influence deepened. Artists created sculptures capturing their likeness, powerful bronze figures wearing flight jackets, goggles resting on helmets, faces cast toward an invisible horizon. These statues appeared in plazas, museums, airports, and military academies. They became landmarks, places where people paused and reflected on the weight of history. Writers found in the airmen's journey a metaphor for resilience. Their stories appeared in novels, poems, and plays. Some works explored the emotional toll of combat. Others examined the contradictions of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied it at home. Still others focused on the camaraderie that sustained the men through their darkest hours. Filmmakers, too, continued to find inspiration. New documentaries explored angles once overlooked: ground crew perspectives, intelligence officers who worked with them, black women who contributed to the training program at Tuskegee, and bomber crews who owed them their lives. These films added nuance and dimension, ensuring the story evolved rather than ossified. The Tuskegee Airmen had become larger than the sum of their mission. They had become part of the cultural DNA of a nation. But among all the ways their legacy lived on, one stood out as the most personal and profound. Family. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the airmen began to uncover boxes stored in attics and basements. Inside were relics, flight logs, wings, medals, faded photographs, letters mailed from overseas. Some families had never known the extent of their ancestors' service. Others had heard fragments of stories but lacked the details. As these artifacts emerged, so did questions. How many missions had he flown? What did he feel the first time he took off? Did he ever fear he wouldn't return? Who were his friends? What did he see? What did he lose? Families sought answers by attending reunions, reading archives, consulting historians. In the process, they discovered that they were part of something larger than themselves, a lineage defined not only by blood but by courage, determination, and pride. At memorials and ceremonies, descendants sometimes spoke with trembling voices. One granddaughter, standing before a crowd, said, "I used to think my grandfather was quiet because he had nothing to say. Now I know he was quiet because he had lived more than he could ever put into words." In the broader world, the airman's story began to resonate in new contexts. When young activists fought for equal access in education or opportunities in STEM fields, they invoked the Tuskegee Airmen as proof of what could be achieved when barriers were dismantled. When corporations sought to diversify their ranks, they cited the airmen as an early example of what happens when talent is recognized rather than restricted. But the Tuskegee story also found relevance in more unexpected places. Leadership seminars taught their discipline under pressure. Sports teams studied their teamwork and loyalty. Entrepreneurs referenced their resilience when facing setbacks. Mental health professionals used their experiences to discuss the burden of expectation. In every arena, their narrative offered lessons about grit, purpose, and belief. Then came a moment that crystallized just how deeply the Tuskegee Airmen had entered the American consciousness. On a quiet morning, a restored P-51 with a gleaming red tail took off from a small airfield in the Midwest. Its owner, a pilot who had spent years restoring the aircraft, decided to take it on a cross-country journey, flying across states where the original airmen had trained, lived, or served. At each stop, people gathered. Veterans, children, family, enthusiasts. Some drove hours to see the aircraft. Others brought old photos or memorabilia. A few brought letters written by airmen decades earlier. At one stop, an 11-year-old boy approached the aircraft with wide eyes. He touched the red tail and whispered, "They flew this." The pilot smiled. "No," he said gently, "but they flew ones just like it." The boy stood silent for a moment, then said, "I want to fly too." It was in that moment, a child touching the red tail, with the awe of possibility, that the true power of legacy became undeniable. And so, even in a world that had moved far beyond the piston engines and analog dials of the 1940s, the spirit of the Tuskegee Airmen soared on. They had become a story retold in every generation, each time gaining new depth, new meaning, new relevance. Their voice spoke through the roar of airshows. Their courage echoed in classrooms. Their discipline guided the training of pilots. Their sacrifices shaped the conscience of a nation. Their example encouraged people to rise above their circumstances. They had begun life as young men facing doubt and discrimination. They had risen to become warriors in a faraway sky. They had returned as quiet champions in a world slow to acknowledge them. And they had departed as icons whose legacy only grew stronger with time. The Tuskegee Airmen had proven something timeless, that when talent is allowed to soar, humanity rises with it. That courage cuts through prejudice like sunlight through cloud. That the limits imposed by others are never the limits of one's own potential. They taught the world that greatness cannot be segregated, that dignity needs no permission, that the sky is wide enough for all. And though decades have passed since their Mustangs last took flight, their story remains evergreen, a living testament to what happens when courage takes wing and refuses to land. In the decades that followed the passing of the last Tuskegee Airmen, the world around their legacy continued to evolve. New generations grew up in an America far different from the one the airmen had known, an America shaped, in no small part, by the doors they had helped open. And yet, despite the changing landscape of technology, culture, and society, the essence of their story remained timeless. It was a beacon whose light did not dim, even as history marched onward. Part of what allowed their narrative to endure so vibrantly was the way people continued to uncover forgotten fragments of their journey. It seemed that, even long after the airmen themselves were gone, the past had not finished speaking. In a small attic in Kansas, a granddaughter discovered a bundle of flight maps her grandfather had used while stationed at Ramitelli. The maps were annotated with pencil marks that had grown faint over timelines showing escort routes over Austria, arrows marking Luftwaffe interception zone, notes in the margins reminding him to check manifold pressure at altitude. She donated them to a museum, where they became part of an immersive exhibit. In Ohio, a box was found containing film reels that documented ground crew operations at the airfield. The footage, once restored, revealed mechanics working into the night under floodlights, faces smeared with grease, hands blistered from wrenching stubborn bolts loose, uniforms stained with sweat and oil. The intensity of their labor conveyed a truth long overlooked, that the Tuskegee Airmen's success was built not only on the courage of pilots, but on the relentless dedication of the men who kept their planes airworthy. In Alabama, volunteers began cataloging oral histories, recorded decades earlier, interviews that had never been transcribed. The voices crackled through old tape recorders, carrying stories that felt as fresh as if the speakers had just walked in from the flight line. Some spoke with pride, some with pain, all with a depth that only living memory can hold. These discoveries enriched the narrative, adding hues to a tapestry that, even after so many years, continued to grow. At the same time, interest in the red tails grew internationally. Scholars from Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America came to study their impact, not only as a military force, but as a social phenomenon. The Tuskegee Airmen became a global symbol of resilience, representing the universal fight against oppressive systems. In Italy, near the old Ramitelli airfield, locals built a small memorial commemorating the airmen who once flew from their soil. Villagers whose parents had lived through the war told stories handed down through their families, stories of pilots who shared food with hungry children, who offered small kindnesses during a time of fear, who radiated dignity in a land caught between armies. One elderly Italian man recalled how his father had described the American pilots with the red-tailed plane. "They respected us," he said. "They treated us like people. That mattered then. It matters now." In Germany, historians examined Luftwaffe accounts of encounters with the red tail. Some German pilots had recorded their shock at the precision and determination of the black American aviator. Others, writing years after the war, reflected on how deeply the experience had challenged the racial ideology they had been raised in. A German scholar summarized the impact succinctly: "They shattered a myth, and myths, once broken, cannot be rebuilt." Meanwhile, in the United States, a new form of remembrance took shape: digital archive. High-resolution scans of flight interviews, photographs, and mission maps became available online, accessible to anyone with curiosity and an internet connection. Teachers in rural communities, who once struggled to find resources, could now pull up combat reports or watch footage of P-51 Mustangs taxiing at Ramitelli. Young people accustomed to interactive experiences explored virtual exhibits where they could rotate 3D models of the aircraft, zoom in on cockpit instruments, and trace mission routes in augmented reality. The digital age brought the Tuskegee story to life in ways previous generations could only dream of. And yet, despite the technological marvel, the emotional core of the story remained unchanged. It still resonated because it was human. It dealt with fear, courage, doubt, hope, injustice, brotherhood, loss, and triumph. No matter how advanced the medium, the message was eternal. One unexpected ripple of their legacy appeared in popular culture. The red tail, once simply a tactical marking, became a visual shorthand for excellence against the odds. It appeared in fashion shows, graphic novels, music videos, and even on the tail fins of some commercial aircraft as part of special heritage design. Athletes adopted the red tail motif as a symbol of discipline and mastery. Some painted red stripes on their shoes or helmets for inspiration. Musicians referenced the airmen in lyrics celebrating perseverance. Filmmakers used allusions to the red tails to frame stories about heroes from underrepresented backgrounds. The red tail had become more than paint. It had become a metaphor. In communities across the country, museums dedicated to the Tuskegee Airmen continued to evolve. Exhibits expanded. Displays became more interactive. Archives grew. New wings were added. One museum installed a full-scale replica of the Ramitelli control tower, allowing visitors to climb up and look out over the imagined airfield, hearing the roar of engines through carefully designed audio. Another museum acquired a restored P-51D Mustang with a polished aluminum body and a crimson tail. Whenever the aircraft performed a startup demonstration, the crowd would fall silent as the Merlin engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. Children covered their ears. Veterans stood still, and the sound carried with it the presence of the airmen more powerfully than any spoken word. A third museum created a flight simulation experience where visitors sat in mock cockpits modeled after the Mustang. They gripped control sticks, scanned virtual skies, and felt the rush of chasing enemy aircraft. Many walked out with a new appreciation for the skill required to navigate that world of speed, precision, and danger. In these spaces, The airmen lived again not as distant figures in textbooks, but as guides, mentors, and examples. Among the most poignant developments of this new era was the way young pilots honored the airmen during their own milestone. In flight schools across the country, Black pilots who now face challenges very different from those of 1941 often dedicated their first solo flights to the red tail. Some taped small photos of the airmen to their instrument panels. Others carried a patch or a pin inside their flight suit. On social media, young aviators posted photos of themselves standing in front of aircraft with the caption, "For the red tail." Some wrote messages to the airmen as though speaking across time. "I hope I make you proud. You showed me I belong here. Your dream lives in." One pilot wrote a message that went viral. "You flew so I could rise." This intergenerational bond gave the legacy a heartbeat that pulsed powerfully into the future. Perhaps the most touching aspect of the Tuskegee Airmen's second life was the way their story continued to heal. In communities still grappling with the wounds of racism, their achievements served as a catalyst for dialogues that were often difficult but essential. Their example allowed people to discuss history not as an abstraction, but as a lived reality. They provided proof that systems could change when confronted with undeniable excellence. In schools where tensions simmered, teachers found that the story of the Red Tails united students who otherwise struggled to find common ground. Boys and girls of all backgrounds found inspiration in the tale of young pilots who defied expectations and soared above prejudice. One teacher recounted how a quiet student, often withdrawn, became animated for the first time during a unit on the Airmen. He spent weeks researching pilots, creating a presentation, and designing a model Mustang. When asked why the story mattered, he said simply, "They didn't give up." Another student, hearing the story of how the airmen protected bombers even when other fighter groups chased kills for glory, whispered, "That's what it means to look out for people." These are the moments where legacy crystallizes not in monuments, but in mind. And yet, even as their legacy entered classrooms, museums, airshows, and digital archives, there remained a sense that something sacred persisted, a quiet, almost spiritual quality that surrounded the memory of the airmen. Visitors to their grave sites sometimes reported a feeling of reverence, as though the air itself carried the weight of their sacrifices. Veterans who had never met a Tuskegee airman found themselves thanking them aloud in private moments. Pilots standing atop wind-swept runways felt a connection to men who once faced the same horizon with uncertainty and resolve. One modern fighter pilot captured this sentiment perfectly in an interview. "When I'm up there, and I look down at the world, I think of those young men in their Mustang. They didn't just fly. They fought for the right to fly. And every one of us is better because they did." And so, as the story continued to spread outward into homes, heart, classroom, and cockpits, it became clear that the Tuskegee Airmen had achieved something few in history ever do. They had created a legacy that grew stronger with time, not because people romanticized them, but because the truth of what they accomplished was powerful enough to sustain itself. Not because they were idealized, but because they were real. Not because they were perfect, but because they persevered. Their journey began with doubt and discrimination. It transformed into discipline and skill. It culminated in triumph and honor. And it evolved into a legacy that transcended war, transcended generations, transcended even their own lives. The sky they once flew through, vast, perilous, full of promise, remained their eternal monument. And every time a red-tailed aircraft lifts its nose and takes to the air, every time a student learns their names, every time a pilot whispers a silent thanks before takeoff, every time someone believes they can rise above limitation, the Tuskegee Airmen fly again. And as the decades continued to unfold, the Tuskegee Airmen's legacy began to influence not only individuals and institutions, but the very narrative of World War II itself. Historians who once centered the air war on the familiar names of fighter aces and bomber groups now found themselves revising their frameworks to make room for a story that had been marginalized for too long. The Red Tails were no longer a footnote, they were a chapter, a pillar, a turning point. The war, once viewed through the lens of strategy, battles, and national leadership, now had to be reconsidered through the lens of human possibility. The Tuskegee Airmen shifted the conversation from what machines could do to what people could accomplish when given the chance. And in this reconsideration, something profound emerged, a new understanding of the war as not just a global conflict, but a crucible in which the ideals of democracy were tested from within. The Airmen's service illuminated the contradiction at the heart of America, fighting for freedom abroad while denying it to many at home. Their triumph did not erase this contradiction, but it exposed it to the world, forcing the nation to confront its own image. It was this confrontation that planted seeds for change. One of the most remarkable demonstrations of how deeply their legacy had been integrated into the historical consciousness came during a symposium on military ethics held at the U.S. Naval War College. Professors, generals, and researchers gathered to discuss the moral dimensions of warfare: duty, discrimination, loyalty, sacrifice. Amid presentations on drone warfare, cyber conflict, and the evolution of battlefield command, one panel stood out: the Tuskegee Airmen and the Ethics of Recognition. A retired general opened the session with words that silenced the room. The Tuskegee Airmen did not simply protect bombers, he said. They protected the idea of America. They defended the ideals this country claimed to represent even when the country failed to extend those ideals to them. He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle. They showed us what integrity looks like under pressure, and they reminded us that moral courage is often more difficult than physical courage. The audience sat in stillness. It was a moment that revealed just how far the airmen's influence had traveled from segregated airfields to academic halls of power, their example now shaping ethical thought within the highest branches of the military. Meanwhile, outside the world of scholarship and ceremony, their story continued to ripple through everyday life. A young mechanic in Chicago, learning to repair aircraft, kept a photo of the red tails taped above his workbench for inspiration. A mother in Los Angeles named her son after one of the airmen who had flown 70 missions and returned home to become a teacher. A group of teenage aviation enthusiasts in Florida formed a club called the Red Tail Flyers, dedicated to building model aircraft and studying aerodynamics. A community center in New York launched a mentoring program using the airmen's values as guiding principle: discipline, excellence, teamwork. The airmen had become a beacon for people far removed from aviation or military service. Their story provided a framework for understanding personal ambition, the belief that with enough preparation, resilience, and courage, even the greatest obstacles could be overcome. A high school student in Atlanta, struggling academic, wrote in her journal after studying the Tuskegee Airmen, "They didn't let the world tell them who they could be. I won't either." The airmen had become a mirror in which people saw their own possibilities reflected. As the narrative continued to expand, so too did the efforts to preserve the places tied to their history. The old training fields in Tuskegee, once neglected, were restored with care. Hangars were rebuilt, runways were cleared of overgrowth. Interpretive signs were placed along the airfield, guiding visitors through the story of the young cadets who once trained there. Walking these grounds became a pilgrimage for many. Parents brought their children. Veterans came to pay respect. Students wandered the runways, imagining the ground trembling beneath the wheels of Mustangs preparing to take flight. Some visitors described the experience as haunting. Others called it inspiring, but all felt something profound. One visitor, after standing alone in a quiet hangar where the airmen once learned to maintain aircraft, said, "It feels like the walls remember them." Another, walking the perimeter of the airfield at sunset, whispered, "This is where they became legend." Even after the structures decayed and were rebuilt, the soul of the place remained the air itself, carrying echoes of young men whose footsteps helped shape history. In the realm of academia, a new branch of research emerged: the psychology of resilience under systemic pressure. Scholars began using the Tuskegee Airmen as a case study for understanding how individuals and groups excel in environments where they are underestimated or marginalized. Researchers explored how the airmen maintained morale despite constant scrutiny, how they built cohesive teams despite segregation, how they cultivated excellence in a system designed to measure their failures more than their success. One psychologist noted, "They achieved mastery not because they were trying to prove others wrong, but because they refused to limit themselves to what others believed." This insight reshaped discussions around leadership, motivation, and performance. It was no longer enough to acknowledge the airmen's skill. Now scholars sought to understand the internal mechanisms that allowed them to excel. Their legacy was expanding into new fields, inspiring breakthroughs in understanding the human mind as much as the human spirit. Meanwhile, their influence continued to find new form. A group of young filmmakers created a virtual reality experience that allowed users to sit in the cockpit of a red-tailed P-51, facing the horizon as the engine thundered to life. Viewers experienced moments of a bomber escort mission approaching formations, scanning for enemy aircraft, navigating through flak bursts. For many, the experience was transformative. It wasn't about glorifying war, it was about honoring courage. It allowed participants to understand, even briefly, the intensity of the environment the airmen had mastered. One young participant removed the headset after the simulation, tears in her eyes. "I didn't know they were that brave," she whispered. Another said, "I felt like I was flying with them." The virtual sky had become another domain where the Tuskegee legacy soared. And yet, even as their story moved into new technological and cultural landscapes, it continued to resonate most powerfully in moments of personal transformation, those quiet, fragile moments where someone struggling to believe in themselves found strength in the airmen's example. A young cadet in ROTC, doubting his abilities, read about a Tuskegee pilot who overcame repeated setbacks during training. Inspired, he pushed himself harder and succeeded. A young woman facing prejudice in a technical field kept a portrait of the Red Tails on her desk as a reminder that resilience beats doubt. A veteran suffering from PTSD listened to interviews with Tuskegee Airmen discussing fear and survival, finding comfort in knowing that courage is not the absence of fear but the mastery of it. In these deeply personal spaces, the airmen continued to serve not as warriors, but as guides. Even the way pilots spoke about the sky changed. Before, the sky had been a realm of science, physics, calculation. Now it had also become a realm of legacy, memory, and meaning. A modern fighter pilot flew a training mission and afterward wrote in his flight log, "The sky felt larger today. I think it's because I remembered who flew before me." Another pilot, preparing for his first deployment, whispered a simple phrase before stepping into the cockpit. For the Red Tail, it wasn't ritual, it wasn't superstition, it was gratitude. And so, the story, once nearly lost to time, continued to expand, driven by people who understood what the airmen represented and refused to let their contributions fade into obscurity. The Tuskegee Airmen had become more than historical figures. They had become a testament to the enduring power of belief, a reminder that barriers can be dismantled, a symbol of courage in the face of doubt, a story that grew deeper, richer, and more vital with each passing year. And though the last of the Red Tails had long since flown their final mission, the world they left behind continued to rise, lifted by the winds of the legacy they forged. For their greatest flight was never measured in miles, altitude, or confirmed victories. It was measured in the generations they inspired, the minds they changed, the possibilities they revealed. And in that sense, the Tuskegee Airmen never stopped flying. They simply traded their Mustangs for the boundless sky of memory, a sky that remains theirs forever. In the years that followed, the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen began to stretch into realms that even the most forward-thinking historians had not predicted. What started as a military experiment had become a cultural compass, and enduring guide for how societies confront their prejudices, correct their mistakes, and redefine their understanding of excellence. And as this legacy deepened, it began to influence not only history, but identity. One of the most unexpected developments arose within the broader field of American memory study. Scholars who examined how nations remember their pasts discovered that the Tuskegee narrative had begun to serve as a benchmark, a kind of moral barometer measuring how the nation reconciles its ideals with its acts. The airmen's story stood at the intersection of patriotism and protest, duty and discrimination, victory and injustice. And in that intersection, the country found clarity. Professors teaching college courses on memory theory used the Tuskegee Airmen as a case study. How does a nation remember heroes it once excluded? What happens when truth survives the silence of institutions? How do individual stories reshape the collective narrative? The airmen became the answer to these questions, their story demonstrating that darkness in history does not erase the light, it makes the light more necessary. At the same time, genealogists and family historians dedicated increasing energy to tracing the descendants of both the pilots and ground crew. What they discovered was a sprawling, interconnected legacy that reached into nearly every corner of American society. Some of the airmen's descendants became doctors, educators, entrepreneurs, and leaders. Others continued the tradition of service, joining the military, police, fire departments, or public office. While many descendants had never met their Tuskegee ancestors, they felt the weight of their legacy nonetheless. A grandson in Virginia joined the Air Force after learning his grandfather had flown 60 missions. A great-granddaughter in California became an aerospace engineer, inspired by the knowledge that her ancestor had once maintained Mustangs on the Italian coast. A family in Chicago discovered that two brothers, both Tuskegee Airmen, had served in the same fighter squadron, a revelation that reshaped their understanding of their own. Some families kept their ancestors' belongings as sacred heirlooms, a set of worn dog tags, a flight jacket with frayed cuff, goggles with cracked lenses, or a diary filled with entries written under dim lights in wartime barracks. These objects became artifacts not of war, but of courage. Meanwhile, educators and historians continued refining what became known as the Tuskegee curriculum, an interdisciplinary approach to teaching the airmen's story. The curriculum spread across the nation and made its way into schools that previously had never mentioned the 332nd Fighter Group or the 99th Fighter Squadron. The Tuskegee curriculum intertwined history with ethics, aviation with psychology, social studies with literature. Students analyzed the political motives behind the Tuskegee experiment. They studied the mechanical specifications of the P-40 Warhawk and the P-51 Mustang. They read primary source letters describing the emotional struggle of flying high-stakes missions. They debated the moral contradictions of fighting for freedom abroad while living under segregation at home. And as they worked through these lessons, something profound occurred. Students who once struggled to connect with history began to see themselves in it. One teacher in Arizona described how a quiet student who rarely spoke became a leader during a unit on the Airmen. He saw something in their story, she said, something he needed. This was the quiet power of the Tuskegee legacy, meeting people where they were and lifting them upward. In the world of literature, the Airmen continued inspiring new voices. Fiction writers reimagined their journeys through novels exploring the emotional landscape of wartime service. Poets wrote verses capturing the contrast between the vastness of the sky and the constraints of segregation. Historians produced detailed monographs examining the intricacies of each mission, each squadron, each phase of the Tuskegee program. What emerged was not a single narrative, but a constellation of narratives, each one illuminating a different facet of the airmen's experience. Some stories focused on their triumph, others explored their struggles. Together, they created a mosaic of humanity. A young novelist described why she felt compelled to write about the airmen. They lived at the edge of the world, between the sky and the fire below. That kind of life writes itself into the soul. Aviation museums, too, continued expanding their tributes. The Smithsonian and the National World War II Museum created deeper, more immersive exhibits featuring the Red Tails. Smaller aviation museums across the country dedicated entire wings to their story. Some displayed full-size aircraft replicas with detailed cockpit, complete with throttle quadrants, control sticks, and instrumentation exactly as the airmen once used. Visitors stood in awe beside these aircraft, which seemed both immense and delicate at the same time. Children climbed into mock cockpits, gripping cold metal sticks and imagining themselves flying through flak-filled skies. Adults lingered before photographs of young airmen smiling in flight jackets, their expressions reflecting confidence mixed with the unspoken awareness of danger. A museum curator once observed, "People come to see the airplanes, but they stay to learn about the men." Even outside aviation circles, the airmen's story continued to influence broader cultural conversation. In debates about representation in STEM fields, the Tuskegee Airmen served as an example of how opportunity can transform talent into excellence. Their legacy appeared in think tank discussions, education reform proposals, and even in corporate diversity training programs. A CEO of a major aerospace company spoke at a conference, stating, "If we want innovation, we must learn from the Tuskegee Airmen. They showed that talent exists everywhere. Opportunity must exist everywhere too." The applause that followed wasn't just for the sentiment, it was for the acknowledgement that the airmen's story still held power in places where decisions shaped the future. One of the most emotionally resonant tributes came from the world of animation and media. Children's shows created subtly disguised homages, characters who flew with red markings on their aircraft, heroes who overcame prejudice through discipline and teamwork. These portrayals introduced the airmen to audiences too young to understand war but old enough to appreciate bravery. A mother once wrote to a museum after her son saw a cartoon inspired by the Red Tail. "He asked me if it was real. When I told him yes," he said, "then they were the bravest men ever." Such moments revealed that the airmen's legacy had entered a new stage, becoming part of the moral vocabulary of childhood. But perhaps the most profound testament to their enduring influence came in the form of a simple phenomenon: conversation. People talked about them. Friends discussed their story over coffee. Teachers discussed them in staff meetings. Pilots discussed them before flights. Parents discussed them with their children. Veterans discussed them with reverence. These conversations kept the airmen alive, not as figures trapped in the past, but as guides for the present. One Vietnam veteran, after visiting a Tuskegee exhibit, said, "I served because they served. They made it possible for me." A young woman training to become a pilot said, "When I get scared, I think of them. If they could fly through a world that tried to hold them down, I can fly too." A grandfather, taking his grandson to a museum, said, "These were real men. Remember that, real men." And the grandson nodded solemnly, absorbing the weight of the words. The airmen's story also found new life in global movement. Their legacy resonated with marginalized communities around the world. In South Africa, civil rights activists saw parallels between the airmen's journey and their own struggle against apartheid. In India, scholars studying caste discrimination used the Tuskegee narrative as an example of how oppressed communities could excel when given opportunity. In Brazil, where racial inequality was deeply embedded in society, the story of the Red Tails became part of university lectures on resistance and excellence. A Brazilian historian wrote, "They were warriors of the air, but they fought more than a war. They fought an idea. And they won." The global recognition of the Tuskegee legacy demonstrated a universal truth. Courage resonates across borders because injustice recognizes no boundaries, and hope speaks a language understood by all. Toward the end of this expanding era of remembrance, a remarkable event took place. A coalition of museums, Historians, pilots, and veterans organizations proposed creating a national Tuskegee Airmen Heritage Trailland interconnected journey tracing the major sites of their training, deployment, and return. The trail would begin in Tuskegee, Alabama, at Mote Field. It would continue through Montgomery, where the airmen trained in segregated facilities, then to Florida, where they completed advanced pilot qualification, then to Ohio and Illinois, where many trained on new aircraft. Finally to Washington, D.C., where exhibits enshrined their accomplishments. The trail was meant not only as a historical pathway but as a symbolic journey, a movement through the places where young men once transformed their lives and, in doing so, changed their nation. One historian described the trail as a pilgrimage of possibility. Another said, "It is a way of walking through the footsteps of courage." The proposal gained national attention. Funding followed. Construction began. And when the trail finally opened, thousands traveled its length, some to honor their ancestors, some to confront history, some simply to be inspired. Throughout all of this, one truth remained constant. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen did not belong solely to the past. It belonged to anyone who faced doubt and still found the courage to rise. To anyone who challenged injustice through excellence. To anyone who believed that greatness is not defined by circumstance, but by the refusal to accept limitation. Their story had transcended time because the values they embodied were universal. Discipline, honor, skill, resilience, brotherhood, belief. These were not qualities tied to an era, they were qualities tied to the human spirit. And so the legacy lived on, expanding through new generations that found in the airmen not just heroes, but reflections of what they themselves could become. For as long as the sky exists, as long as humanity looks upward, the Tuskegee Airmen will remain there, etched into the boundless blue, forever climbing. As the Tuskegee Airmen's legacy continued to stretch into new frontiers, a fascinating transformation took place. Their story began to influence how America understood not only its past, but its imagination of the future. The more the nation revisited their contributions, the more people began to ask an unexpected question: what else might be possible if barriers fall? This question surfaced in think tank discussions on national security. It appeared in debates about scientific innovation. It resonated in conversations about education, representation, and leadership. The airman's journey, once confined to the dusty pages of segregated history, had become a philosophical lens through which people examined the challenges ahead. In this way, the Tuskegee Airmen were no longer simply figures anchored in World War II. They had become architects of possibility, guiding the way humans imagined progress in the 21st century. At the Air Force Academy, a series of new leadership seminars used the airman's story as a foundational model. Cadets studied the psychological resilience that allowed the airmen to excel under extreme scrutiny. They examined the tactical discipline that enabled the 332nd Fighter Group to achieve its extraordinary bomber protection record. And they analyzed the moral clarity that empowered the airmen to serve honorably in a nation that did not always grant them dignity. In one such seminar, a senior instructor addressed a room full of cadets and asked, "What do the Tuskegee Airmen teach us about leadership?" Dozens of hands rose, but one cadet's answer silenced the room. "They teach us that leadership is not about being trusted," she said. "It's about being trustworthy even when no one trusts you." The instructor nodded, knowing that this was the heart of the lesson. For the airmen had not simply challenged the prejudice around them. They had transformed leadership itself by proving that excellence thrives not because of external validation, but in spite of its absence. In civilian life, the airman's story began influencing sectors far beyond aviation. Corporate leadership programs adopted the red tail narrative to illustrate principles of determination, teamwork, and integrity. Educators used their journey to demonstrate how potential can be suppressed or unleashed depending on societal structures. Community organizers cited the airmen when discussing how collective hope can overcome collective doubt. A CEO of a major technology company described the airmen in a keynote speech. They were innovators in an environment designed to prevent innovation. They proved that talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And if we want to build the future, we must stop confusing barriers with limits. The audience erupted in applause, not because of corporate optimism, but because the message spoke to a truth the Tuskegee Airmen had embodied long before anyone used words like diversity or inclusion. Meanwhile, the physical artifacts of the airmen continued to surface in unexpected places, each discovery adding another piece to the evolving mosaic of their story. In Michigan, workers renovating an old home found a metal trunk containing meticulously preserved flight manuals, mission notes, and photographs belonging to a Tuskegee pilot who had passed away decades earlier. The photos, many unseen, captured candid moments of fellowship at raw metallic. Pilots sharing cigarettes, ground crew laughing beside a fuel truck, a mechanic wiping grease from his hands with a satisfied grin. These images revealed a humanity beyond the heroism, moments of simple brotherhood that anchored the airmen through the turbulence of war and the tensions of segregation. In Louisiana, a family sorting through a father's belongings found a small pocket notebook containing the names of every man in his squadron, each name accompanied by personal notes. Quiet but steady. Fearless under pressure. Expert mechanic. Best shot in the group. Mother's boy. Never complained. This small book, worn and stained, made its way to historians, who recognized it as a rare record of personal bonds inside a unit whose camaraderie was vital to its survival. These discoveries reminded the world that the Tuskegee Airmen's story was not a single monolith, but thousands of individual stories woven into a single tapestry of courage. As attention to the airmen grew, so did the commitment to documenting their experience through oral history. Recording teams traveled across the country interviewing descendants, community leaders, scholars, and military personnel influenced by the airmen. They compiled stories that revealed the ripple effects of the airmen's legacy across generations. A man in his 70s described how his father, once a Tuskegee mechanic, had raised him with extraordinary discipline, shaped by the exacting standards of wartime aircraft maintenance. He said the plane didn't care if you were tired. It didn't care if you were angry. It didn't care if some officer treated you unfairly. The plane cared only about whether you did your job, and people's lives depended on it. I grew up with that idea. A woman in her 30s, a modern Air Force pilot, described the emotional impact of meeting one of the last surviving airmen before he died. He held my hand, she said, her voice trembling, and he told me, "Fly with honor, and every time I take off, I think of him." A high school teacher in Oklahoma described how teaching the Tuskegee story changed the behavior of her students. They stopped seeing history as something that happened to someone else, she said. They saw it as something they could shape. These recordings were archived not simply as history, but as maps of influence, proof that the airmen's story continued to shape the world. In this era of rekindled remembrance, a particular focus emerged on the emotional journeys of the airmen themselves. Scholars began exploring how these men processed the duality of their experience, celebrated for their wartime service abroad but forced to confront segregation upon returning home. Letters and diaries revealed the complexity of their feelings. Some airmen wrote about the pride they felt flying combat mission. Others wrote candidly about their anger at the country they fought for. Many wrote about the tension of returning to a nation that still saw them as second-class citizens. One pilot wrote in 1946, "I left as a fighter pilot. I returned as a colored man." Another wrote, "We proved ourselves in Europe. Now we must prove ourselves at home. But I am tired. I am very tired." These entries, once overlooked, now formed a crucial part of the narrative, not to diminish the airmen's triumph, but to give them dimensionality. Their legacy was not forged in glory alone. It was forged in struggle. It was forged in the tension between who they were and how they were seen. It was forged in the battle to reconcile patriotism with pain. It was forged in the belief that excellence could chip away at injustice. Even as the airmen's emotional complexity came to light, their tactical influence continued to spark interest. Military strategists studied their discipline as a case study in mission focus. Their escort doctrine, prioritizing bomber protection over pursuit of enemy fighters, became a hallmark example of tactical integrity in training programs. The airmen's ability to remain cohesive under systemic pressure became the subject of analysis in modern officer courses. How did they maintain morale? How did they build trust? How did they turn exclusion into unity? What internal culture allowed them to excel? A colonel teaching a course on aerial warfare called the Red Tails the most efficient unit under the most inefficient circumstances. Another officer said, "They turned adversity into precision." The airmen, even decades after their passing, continued to instruct the military that once doubted them. The legacy also found expression in modern activism, though often subtly. Young leaders looked to the airmen not as political figures, but as proof that institutional change was possible. Their example illustrated that systems could be altered from within, through persistence, brilliance, and solidarity. Their courage became a blueprint for resilience. Their discipline became a roadmap for reform. Their triumph became a lesson in patience and perseverance. Activists invoked the airmen when discussing education, equal opportunity, veterans issues, and civic response. Public speakers quoted their words. Graphic designers used the red tail in protest art not as a symbol of conflict, but of uplift. The airmen had become symbols of ascent. In the realm of aerospace, their influence continued to echo in extraordinary ways. When NASA launched initiatives aimed at increasing minority representation in engineering and astronautics, they cited the Tuskegee Airmen as foundational figures who helped make modern diversity in the space program possible. In a moving tribute at the Kennedy Space Center, a black astronaut saluted a photograph of the airmen before boarding a spacecraft. "They flew so high," he said. Now we fly for them. It was a moment that bridged the propeller era and the space age to horizons of human ambition connected by a single lineage of courage. As the narrative pressed deeper into the national consciousness, something remarkable occurred. People began to imagine the airmen not as figures confined to the past, but as companions in the present. They became a mental presence, a source of strength during moments of uncertainty. A young woman preparing for a rigorous exam whispered to herself, "If they could do it, so can I." A father struggling to provide for his family looked at a photograph of the Red Tails and said, "They didn't quit. I won't either." A young artist facing rejection found comfort in their story, realizing that greatness often emerges in defiance of doubt. In these moments, quiet, private, intimate, the airmen lived again. And as the story continued to expand, evolve, and deepen, one ultimate truth became clear. The Tuskegee Airmen had not simply changed history. They had changed human possibility. They had revealed what happens when talent is liberated from prejudice. They had shown what becomes possible when discipline meets purpose. They had demonstrated that courage is contagious. They had proven that excellence, once unleashed, cannot be suppressed. They had rewritten not only the rules of war, but the rules of identity. Their story endured because it touched something fundamental, something timeless, something universal, something profoundly human. The Red Tails had taken flight once, but their legacy never landed. It continues to climb, rising through the generations, upward into the infinite sky where the brave ascend and legends reside. In the expanding decades of remembrance, a subtle yet profound idea began to crystallize in the minds of historians, pilots, educators, and everyday citizens. The Tuskegee Airmen had become more than a historical unit. They had become a moral compass, not in the sense of prescribing what people must do, but in demonstrating what people can do when courage is fused with conviction. This truth grew especially powerful as the world entered an era defined by rapid technological change and social uncertainty. In times when many wondered whether traditional forms of heroism still mattered, the story of the Red Tails resurfaced again and again as evidence that character, not circumstance, defines greatness. Their journey, once shaped by the rigid lines of segregation, now flowed across continents, disciplines, and generations. It provided grounding in a world that often felt untethered. In a quiet corner of Alabama, a new memorial was built along a walking trail near the historic flight line at Moton Field. It was a simple design, a long, curving wall of polished stone engraved with the names of every Tuskegee Airman pilot. Mechanics, navigators, bombardiers, weather officers, cooks, administrators, nurses, and crew chiefs, over 15,000 names in total. Visitors often stood before the wall in silence, reading each name as though reciting a litany. The stone surface reflected the sky above, a symbolic gesture, as if the airmen's memory rose into the heavens they once commanded. One father brought his young daughter to the memorial. She traced her small fingers across the engraved letters and asked, "Did all of them fly airplanes?" Her father knelt beside her and said, "Some flew, some fixed the airplane, some planned missions, some cooked meals, some drove truck, but all of them helped each other. That's what made them strong." The girl nodded, as if committing this truth to memory. This was the enduring power of their story. It revealed that greatness was not singular, but collective. As the 21st century progressed, a new generation of historians began examining the Red Tails as part of a broader global narrative. They drew parallels between the Tuskegee Airmen and other marginalized military units around the world: Japanese-American units in Europe, Navajo code talkers in the Pacific, South Asian pilots in the Royal Air Force, Caribbean aviators in the British Air Service. These histories, once isolated, found connection in the themes of resilience and excellence despite systemic barriers. Scholars collaborated across countries, producing comparative studies that revealed striking similarities. Communities underestimated, individuals doubted, barriers imposed, and triumphs achieved nonetheless. In conferences, academics spoke of a global Tuskegee effect, the phenomenon in which oppressed groups used excellence as a wedge to challenge and ultimately dismantle discriminatory systems. The Tuskegee Airmen were no longer just American heroes. They had become part of a worldwide constellation of narratives showing how courage reshapes societies. Meanwhile, in aviation circles, a new ritual emerged among flight instructors. Before a student completed their first solo flight, many instructors recounted the story of the Red Tails not as a history lesson, but as a grounding philosophy. Stay disciplined, stay humble, trust your training, and fly with honor. These were the words instructors used, echoing the ethos of the Tuskegee Airmen. One instructor, who had flown F-16s for the Air Force, told his students, "Anyone can take off, but not everyone takes responsibility for how they fly." The Tuskegee Airmen did both. The message resonated. Students repeated it to one another. Some wrote it on their kneeboards. Others carved the phrase into the backs of their logbook. In this way, the airmen's principles infiltrated modern aviation quietly, organically, permanently. As modern pilots advanced in their careers, many sought ways to honor the red tails through tradition. On significant milestones, first solo, first cross-country, first carrier landing, first combat sortie, pilots often placed a small red stripe on their flight helmets tucked inside the interior fabric where only they could see it. One Navy pilot described the ritual. "It's not about the color, it's about the courage behind it." A commercial airline pilot kept a Tuskegee photo in her flight bag and touched it before every takeoff. A test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base named his experimental jet test card Project Red Tail inhumane. A helicopter pilot in the Coast Guard shared that during difficult rescue missions, he thought of the airmen as the quiet guardians behind the control. The Red Tails had become a silent brotherhood and sisterhood spanning decades. As digital storytelling matured, the airmen's narrative reached new audiences through media never imagined in the 1940s. High-production documentaries streamed globally. Podcasts dissected their missions in serialized detail. Artists created motion graphics recreating dogfights with stunning accuracy. Digital archivists uploaded high-resolution photos that allowed people to zoom in on the very stitching of flight suits. One viral video featuring side-by-side footage of a red-tailed P-51 and a modern F-35 garnered millions of views. The caption read, "The sky evolved. Courage doesn't." Young viewers who had never opened a history book watched the videos, became captivated, and began searching for more. The Red Tails were now part of digital youth culture, their legacy packaged not as nostalgia but as inspiration. A 15-year-old aspiring pilot from Japan commented on one such video, "I want to fly because of them." The echo of their courage had crossed oceans. Yet even with their presence permeating the digital age, the human component of their legacy remained its most powerful element. In nursing homes and assisted living centers, veterans who had served in later wars sometimes spoke about the Tuskegee Airmen when recounting their own experiences. "They showed us the way," a Korean War veteran said. A Vietnam veteran remarked, "They gave me permission to believe I could make it back." Their influence had become generational, passing from warfighters to warfighter, from service members to civilian, from grandparents to grandchildren. In these intimate spaces, stories whispered at bedside, recounted at family gathering, or shared in the quiet hours of reflection, the Tuskegee Airmen lived again, not as distant figures, but as companions in the lives of those who remembered them. Meanwhile, the academic interest expanded even further. Historians began to challenge long-held assumptions about World War II air combat, integrating newly uncovered Tuskegee mission data into operational analyses. These studies revealed that the 332nd Fighter Group's discipline, formation integrity, and escort philosophy were not merely commendable, they were revolutionary. One researcher, after reviewing dozens of mission reports, stated, "They flew like a single mind, not a collection of individuals." Another concluded, "Their restraint was not passive, it was precision." This reevaluation placed the airmen at the forefront of tactical innovation in the European theater. Their success had not been incidental, it had been engineered through rigor, unity, and strategic clarity. But even as historians elevated the airmen's tactical achievements, descendants and community leaders focused on preserving the cultural memory. Organizations like the Tuskegee Airmen, Inc. continued hosting youth programs, scholarship drive, and mentorship events. A new generation of young black aviators rose through these programs, many earning private pilot licenses before graduating high school. Some went on to military flight training, others pursued aerospace engineering. Still others became commercial pilots or air traffic controllers. They didn't see themselves as replacements for the Tuskegee Airmen. They saw themselves as continuation. One student who obtained her private pilot certificate at age 17 said, "I don't want to be them. I want to honor them." Her instructor later said that her determination came from standing on sacred shoulders. These influences, academic, cultural, personal, global, continued to expand until the Tuskegee Airmen's legacy achieved something exceedingly rare in history. It became self-sustaining. It no longer required the presence of the airmen themselves. It no longer required ceremonies or speeches. It no longer required reminders. It lived in the imagination. It lived in the culture. It lived in the aspirations of people who may never set foot in a cockpit. Their story had become a permanent fixture in the landscape of possibility. And this permanence revealed a profound truth. The Tuskegee Airmen had achieved a form of immortality not through myth, not through legend, but through impact. They lived in every pilot who dared to rise. They lived in every student who believed despite doubt. They lived in every person who chose discipline over despair. They lived in every struggle against injustice. They lived in the very idea that courage could rewrite the rules of the world. Their planes had rusted. Their airfields had faded. Their bodies had passed into the air. But their story soared. It soared above borders, above time, above prejudice. It soared into art, into education, into leadership. It soared into the hearts of those who refused to let limitations define them. The Tuskegee Airmen had once colored their Mustang tails red so bomber crews could identify them in the sky. Today, the world identifies greatness in the red tail. And as long as the sky remains, as long as humans look upward, the airmen will remain too guiding, inspiring, and rising still. In the widening arc of the 21st century, the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen reached a point where it no longer needed to be explained, it simply was. It existed in the collective consciousness of the nation with the same quiet certainty as the stories of the founders, the astronaut, the civil rights leader. Their story, once nearly erased by institutional neglect, now pulsed through the cultural bloodstream as one of the definitive American narratives of courage. What made this transformation extraordinary was the fact that it had not been orchestrated by any government directive or massive institutional campaign. It had grown organically from families, from veterans, from teachers, from historians, from pilots who whispered for the red tails before starting their engine. It spread through art, through memory, through quiet conversations and grand public moments alike. Their legacy was no longer taught. It was felt. In this new era of remembrance, something unexpected occurred. The Tuskegee Airmen's story began to intersect with scientific research in fields far removed from aviation. At a university in Colorado, psychologists studying the impact of representation on performance used the airmen's journey as a foundational case. They found that when individuals from marginalized communities learned about the red tail, their sense of self-efficacy increased. Their willingness to attempt difficult tasks rose. Their resilience in the face of setbacks strengthened. "We are not merely inspired by role models," one researcher wrote. "We internalize their proof." Elsewhere, experts in organizational behavior applied the airmen's experience to studies on adversity-trained excellence, examining how groups can thrive under systems designed to limit them. They identified key traits the airmen demonstrated with uncanny consistency: discipline under pressure, collective identity, goal clarity, emotional regulation, and an unwavering commitment to the mission. Their conclusions became part of leadership training for Fortune 500 companies. Even behavioral economists referenced the red tails when studying how institutions misjudge talent. The Tuskegee Airmen have become not just figures of history, but subjects of science. Simultaneously, the airmen's legacy found new life in art and storytelling. Painters created canvases depicting crimson-tailed Mustangs soaring above cloud banks. Sculptors forged monuments capturing the moment a pilot tightened his goggles before takeoff. Musicians composed orchestral pieces meant to evoke the rhythmic thunder of engines and the quiet dignity of flight briefings at dawn. One composer, after premiering a symphony inspired by the red tails, explained his approach. "They flew into danger with music in their heart. My task was to capture that music." The audience, veterans, families, students, pilots sat in silence as the final notes drifted upward like a departing aircraft disappearing into the sky. As art flourished, so too did scholarship. Historians uncovered details long buried in archives, mission transcripts, forgotten correspondence, personnel files. Museums digitized these documents, allowing the world to explore the airmen's journey with unprecedented depth. In one remarkable discovery, researchers found a set of letters written by a Tuskegee mechanic to his wife. The letters described the weight of responsibility he felt each time he signed off on a Mustang's readiness. "I check every bolt as though you were sitting in the cockpit," he wrote, "because every pilot is someone's husband, someone's son." This simple line resonated deeply with readers. It reminded them that the legacy was built not only by those who flew but by those who made flight possible. The airmen's story grew richer, more textured, more human with each rediscovered detail. While scholars, artists, and educators deepened the narrative, another transformation unfolded among everyday people, one that was subtle, quiet, yet profoundly meaningful. Parents began naming their children after Tuskegee pilots. Schools adopted mascots inspired by the red tails. Community centers used the airmen's values as guiding principles for youth programs. Libraries featured entire sections dedicated to their memory. One principal in Memphis announced a new school motto: "Rise, protect, persevere." She explained that it was drawn from the spirit of the red tail. A pastor in Atlanta delivered a sermon titled "The Gospel of Courage," using the airmen's story to illustrate faith through adversity. In these spaces, schools, churches, community halls, the airmen were not historical artifacts. They were moral exemplars. In the field of filmmaking, the red tails became an enduring subject of fascination. Producers commissioned new documentaries that explored overlooked dimensions of their experience. Black women who supported the program at Tuskegee, intelligence officers who worked alongside the fighter group, Italian villagers who remembered the pilots decades later. A groundbreaking documentary featured interviews with descendants filmed at the old fields where their ancestors once trained. The camera captured tears, laughter, pride, and the solemn weight of legacy. One descendant kneeled and touched the soil of Moat Field. "My grandfather walked here," she whispered. It was a moment that transcended screen and story, binding past and present in a single, powerful gesture. Across the Atlantic, the Airmen's legacy also took on new significance. In Europe, where the Red Tails flew some of their most consequential missions, preservationists restored wartime airfields and erected plaques honoring the 332nd Fighter Group. In Germany, Luftwaffe museums included sections acknowledging encounters with the Tuskegee pilots not with dismay, but with respect. In Italy, small towns near the former Romitelli Air Base held annual festivals commemorating the Americans who once protected their sky. An elderly Italian woman recalled how her father had once shared bread with a Tuskegee pilot. He said the Black Americans were kind, she remembered, and very brave. These international echoes demonstrated that the legacy was not merely national, it was global. One of the most extraordinary aspects of the Airmen's second life emerged in the next generations of aviators. Young pilots of every race, gender, and background internalized the Tuskegee ethos as a philosophy of flight. Some said the airmen taught them how to remain calm in turbulence. Others said the airmen's example helped them overcome imposter syndrome. Still others, facing life's emotional storms, found grounding in the airmen's discipline. A young black pilot, preparing for her first solo flight, wrote on her kneeboard, "If they could fly through hate and fire, I can fly through doubt." She returned from her flight smiling through trembling hands. Her instructor posted her photo beside a mural of the Red Tails. In these moments, intimate, emotional, unpublicized, the legacy lived most vividly. Then came an event that symbolized the full-circle nature of the Airmen's influence. During a special commencement ceremony at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, the school awarded honorary posthumous degrees to all Tuskegee airmen who had pursued aviation careers after the war but had been denied access to training or advancement. Family members accepted the diplomas, some weeping openly as they held the certificates with trembling hands. One elderly daughter whispered, "He wanted this his whole life." A professor on stage commented softly, "It took 80 years, but justice arrived." The audience rose in a standing ovation and acknowledgement that, though delayed, honor had finally come home. In the quiet that followed the applause, the deeper truth became evident. The Tuskegee Airmen had never needed monuments or ceremonies for validation. Their validation was written in the sky. Their recognition was carried in the hearts of those they inspired. Their legacy was secured not by institutions, but by people. And yet, the world now gave them everything they had once been denied: honor, gratitude, reverence, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but out of understanding that their fight had reshaped the meaning of courage, understanding that their skill had redrawn the boundaries of possibility, understanding that their story belonged not to them alone, but to anyone who dared to rise. And so, as the decades continued to pass and the world moved further from the year 1945, the Airmen's influence did not fade, it intensified. Not as nostalgia, not as myth, but as a living force. For every time a child pointed at a red-tailed aircraft, every time a pilot whispered a quiet thank you before takeoff, every time a student found strength in their example, every time a nation revisited its values and chose the path of justice, the Tuskegee Airmen flew again. And in the boundless sky of memory, they will always fly. The decades after the Tuskegee Airmen's passing revealed something historians had long suspected but never fully articulated: that the Airmen had not simply reshaped military history, they had reshaped the American imagination itself. Their story had become a cornerstone in the nation's collective understanding of courage, equal in weight to the tales of astronauts walking on the moon or pioneers crossing the frontier. They represented a form of heroism rooted not in mythology, but in lived struggle. And perhaps that was why their legacy continued to grow. It was real, it was hard-earned, it was human. In the years that followed, archivists, volunteers, and descendants formed a coalition known as the Tuskegee Memory Project, dedicated to preserving every remaining artifact related to the 332nd Fighter Group and the 99th Fighter Squadron. They combed through attics, garages, abandoned footlockers, dusty basements, anywhere memories might still be hiding. A suitcase discovered in Ohio held a treasure trove: mission briefings with handwritten annotations, faded black and white snapshots of pilots posing on Mustang wing, and a reel of 16mm film showing ground crews dancing between maintenance shifts. Historians digitized the footage, preserving scenes that had been slept in darkness for 75 years. One clip showed a young sergeant leaning against a tool chest, wiping sweat from his brow as he grinned at the camera. In the background stood a red-tailed P-51 undergoing a magneto check. The sergeant said something silently. No avio survived, but lip readers later deciphered the words, "We're ready." It was the perfect statement to summarize the ethos of the entire unit. Meanwhile, the Tuskegee Airmen's influence continued to evolve in military training environments. At the Air Force's Squadron Officer School, instructors introduced a new leadership module titled Integrity Under Fire, Lessons from the Red Tail. The module examined not only the tactical decisions the airmen made in the skies over Europe, but also the emotional and psychological endurance required to serve under discriminatory scrutiny. A young officer, reflecting on the course, said, "They didn't get to choose the fight they were born into, but they chose the men they became." Another added, "The airmen taught me that leadership isn't about rank or recognition. It's about resilience." The Red Tails had become a template for modern military ethics, the embodiment of doing the right thing even when the world refuses to reward. Some of the most moving tributes emerged from unexpected places. In Italy, a group of teenagers from the village of Campo Marino, near the old Ramitelli airstrip, began an annual tradition of releasing sky lanterns painted with red tails on the anniversary of the airmen's arrival in 1944. One lantern for each pilot who flew from that patch of earth. When asked why they did it, a local boy replied, "Because they protected us. Our grandparents said so." For these young Italians, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen was not about American history or racial politics. It was about safety, courage, gratitude. The lanterns drifted upward into the darkness, flickering like distant aircraft lights. They created a silhouette in the sky, a shimmering memory of the squadron that once rose from that very land. As the narrative continued to stretch, modern aerospace industries began creating mentorship pipelines inspired by the airmen. Airbus, Boeing, SpaceX, Lockheed Martin, Blue Origin, all launched programs designed to identify young talent in underserved communities and nurture it into engineering careers. Executives referenced the Tuskegee Airmen not merely as historical figures but as engineering icons. They solved problems under pressure, one aerospace director explained. They understood precision, discipline, teamwork, and the unspoken contract between a pilot and the aircraft. Those competencies are timeless. In the design labs of modern space exploration companies, interns taped photocopies of the red tails on their lockers, not because they wanted to be fighter pilots, but because the airmen symbolized the idea that excellence had no boundary. If the airmen could break barriers in 1943, then perhaps anyone could overcome obstacles in 2025. Meanwhile, writers and storytellers continued to excavate personal angles that had never been fully explored. One author focused on the wives, fiancés, and girlfriends who stayed behind during training, the women who wrote letters every week, hoping the mail would keep their loved ones grounded. Another author explored the black press's coverage of the Tuskegee Airmen, how journalists from the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier defied the War Department to report on the airmen's victories when mainstream newspapers refused. A historian wrote an extensive study on the psychological burden the airmen carried, the constant message that any mistake would be attributed not to the individual, but to their entire race. It was, as the historian put it, a double war, one fought in the air, one fought in the soul. These deeper layers added emotional richness to a story that had once been told only in terms of dogfights and statistics. Yet even as the story expanded, there remained one element of the legacy that historians struggled to capture: the laughter. So many oral histories included moments of humor, practical jokes at the hangars, friendly rivalries, good-natured teasing, and the dry wit of men who had learned to endure the absurdity of segregation through camaraderie. One pilot joked in an interview, "We weren't heroes. We were young and foolish and loved flying, and we just happened to be very good at it." Another remembered how pilots would bet cigarettes on which aircraft would taxi out first during morning scramble drills. These moments proved something important. The Tuskegee Airmen were not statues carved in marble. They were men, young, flawed, earnest, scared, determined, who found joy even in war. Their humanity was what made their heroism possible. In Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian curated an exhibit titled Red Wings of Freedom. The timing was unanticipated. They expected modest crowd. Instead, attendance shattered records. Visitors walked in silence through dimly lit halls where P-51 engine parts gleamed like relics. Flight jackets bore the creases of long-ago missions, and hand-drawn nose art hinted at the personalities behind the call signs. One of the most powerful artifacts was a tattered pilot's checklist, folded into fourths, creased and stained with engine oil. At the bottom, hand scribbled in pencil, "Fly right, protect them. Come home." A boy reading the note whispered to his father, "It sounds like a promise." And indeed, it was. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen eventually grew to encompass something larger than aviation, larger than the war, even larger than America. It became a universal parable that oppression cannot extinguish talent, that purpose can outlive prejudice, that courage is not merely the absence of fear but the mastery of it, and that dignity is strongest when it is denied. Their story proved that greatness does not emerge from comfort, greatness emerges from challenge, and in this truth, the world found endless inspiration. As modern military pilots continued to rise through the ranks, many adopted a quiet ritual before major flight. Some touched a red tail patch sewn inside their flight suit. Others carried a small metal charm shaped like a P-51 Mustang. A few whispered a simple phrase before sealing their helmets. Red tails, watch over me. No one taught them this ritual. No official manual recommended it. But it happened, again and again, because the airmen had become spiritual ancestors of the sky. Their presence, though invisible, was unmistakable. And even as time carried the last of the original Tuskegee Airmen into memory, their story continued to climb, gaining altitude with every passing year. From dusty runways in Alabama to sky lantern ceremonies in Italy, from university lecture halls to military simulators, from childhood bedrooms to NASA launch pads, their influence radiated outward like the wake of a passing aircraft. Their red tails had once cut through the European sky, but now their legacy cut through history itself, straight, bright, undeniable. And as long as humankind looks upward and dreams of rising, the Tuskegee Airmen will rise with them. As the world moved deeper into an era of rapid technological advancement, drones replacing pilots, artificial intelligence managing flight systems, satellites guiding every contour of modern warfare, curious paradox emerged. The more complex aviation became, the more people looked backward to the Tuskegee Airmen for grounding. In pilot briefing, instructors often reminded students that despite the sophistication of modern machinery, the core of flight had not changed. It still required clarity, composure, discipline, and moral responsibility. These, they said, were qualities the red tails exemplified better than anyone. Technology evolves, one colonel remarked during a leadership seminar. Character endures, and so, the airmen's legacy remained the compass needle pointing toward true north. Meanwhile, in classrooms across the United States, educators found that the Tuskegee narrative resonated with a new generation grappling with uncertainty and self-doubt. Young people facing academic pressures, family challenges, or personal insecurities discovered in the airmen a profound source of hope. Teachers reported that students who normally disengaged from history showed unexpected interest when learning about the airmen. The story felt accessible, not because it was easy, but because it was human. It was a story about people who succeeded not despite adversity, but through it. A teacher in Arizona explained, "My students look at the red tails and see possibility. They see that you don't have to be born into privilege to achieve greatness. You have to grow into discipline." One student, after a lesson on the airmen's early failures at Tuskegee, wrote in her journal, "I never knew heroes failed. Now I don't feel so scared to try." The airmen continued to teach not just history, but emotional resilience. In the digital age, their story also found new resonance in online communities. Aviation forums dedicated entire threads to analyzing red tail combat maneuvers. College students produced animated shorts reenacting dogfights. VR developers created immersive simulations allowing players to escort bombers over Germany. Young people from countries the airmen had never heard of, India, Brazil, South Africa, Japan, watched recreated footage of their missions and wrote comments like, "I wish I had known about them sooner. I want to be brave like this." They fought two wars and won both. The Tuskegee Airmen had become global role models in a world hungry for genuine heroism. As more stories surfaced, new layers of their humanity emerged. An elderly woman in Mississippi donated a set of letters she had received from a Tuskegee pilot she once loved. The letters revealed a vulnerability seldom associated with wartime heroes. He wrote about fear, about longing, about nights when the sound of distant engines made him tremble. In one letter, he confessed, "I am brave in the air, but on the ground I am just a man hoping I live long enough to see you again." That single line humanized every pilot who had ever strapped into a P-51 and disappeared into flak-filled skies. Historians later included excerpts from these letters in an exhibit titled "The Hearts Behind the Wing." Visitors wept quietly as they read them. It was there, in that mixture of courage and fragility, that people began to understand the full depth of the airmen's journey. Another chapter of the legacy came from the oral histories of bomber crews the red tails protected. Many were elderly, nearing the end of their lives, yet their memories of the airmen remained vivid. A former B-17 navigator said, "You could spot them by the red tails, and when you did, your heart slowed down. You knew you were going to make it home." A B-24 gunner recalled, they'd take flak for us. They'd jump me 109s before we even knew we were under attack. Those boys saved my life more times than I can count. A pilot from the 447th Bomb Group said softly, "We trusted them more than we trusted the weather forecast." These testimonies revealed an emotional truth absent from mission records. The bomber crews didn't simply admire the red tails, they depended on them with their lives. In time, the airmen became a symbol of something larger than bravery. They became evidence of how prejudice blinds societies to their own potential. Sociologists frequently cited the Tuskegee program when discussing the cost of discrimination. They noted that had segregationists succeeded in blocking the program, the United States would have lost hundreds of skilled pilots, mechanics, and officers at a critical moment in the war. One scholar summarized the lesson bluntly: racism nearly cost the Allies the sky. This realization created waves in academic and military discussion. It forced institutions to confront uncomfortable truths about wasted talent and unrecognized brilliance. The airmen had not simply broken barriers, they had exposed the absurdity of those barriers in the first place. Meanwhile, families continued to pass down their personal history. Some preserved uniforms in cedar chests, others displayed medals in living rooms. Still others kept stories alive through spoken tradition. One grandson recalled how his grandfather refused to let him play video games until he recited the Air Force core value. Another said his grandmother insisted he memorize the names of the Tuskegee squadrons before he could join the school's aviation club. These families understood something profound, that history survives not in museums, but in memory. And so the legacy continued, tenderly, fiercely, generationally. Yet even as reverence for the airmen grew, few expected their story to influence national policy. And yet, in 2032, it did. When Congress reviewed proposals aimed at increasing diversity in aerospace engineering, one senator stood and delivered a speech that echoed across the chamber. The Tuskegee Airmen did not wait for opportunity. They built it, but they should not have had to fight two wars to prove their worth. We honor them by ensuring the next generation doesn't have to. The legislation passed. Commentators later observed that the Tuskegee Airmen had achieved something extraordinary. Long after their last flight, they were still shaping the future of aviation. As time flowed on, the number of living airmen diminished until, eventually, no original pilots remained. The world mourned the passing of each one, not as a celebrity, not as a symbol, but as a family member whose life had touched millions. During one memorial, a young Air Force lieutenant saluted the empty chair reserved for the last Tuskegee pilot in her state. She then whispered something almost too quiet to hear: "Sir, we've got the sky from here." And in that moment, everyone present understood the airmen had not disappeared. They had passed their wings to the next generation. In the years that followed, a new tradition emerged among pilots. Whenever one retired from service, they placed a single red feather inside their flight logbook before closing it for the last time. "It's for the ones who flew before me," many explained. The symbol spread from fighter squadrons to commercial cockpits, from flight schools to air shows. Soon, a red feather tucked inside a logbook became a quiet salute to the Tuskegee legacy. One airline captain explained its meaning to his crew: "The feather represents flight, the red represents courage. Together, they represent the men who proved both." And still, through all this remembrance, one truth remained constant. The Tuskegee Airmen's greatest victory was not in the skies over Germany. It was in the hearts of the people they touched, the minds they changed, the pilots they inspired, the students they empowered, the dreams they lifted. Their red tails once guided bomber crews through clouds of fire. Today, their legacy guides humanity through the storms of doubt. And as long as people look upward, as long as people believe in the transformative power of courage, the red tails will continue to fly, not in the air, but in the soul of the world. As the red tails' legacy settled deeper into the cultural fabric of the world, an unexpected dimension of their story began to attract new attention: their influence on collective memory itself. Historians and psychologists studying how societies remembered and forget events realized that the Tuskegee Airmen represented a rare phenomenon. Their story, once nearly erased, had reemerged not weakened by time, but strengthened by it. Most histories fade. There's bright. This reversal fascinated scholars. A professor of cultural memory at Yale called it a resurrection narrative, one of the most extraordinary in American history. He explained that stories survive when they meet three conditions: they are true, they are needed, and they illuminate what people want to believe about themselves. The Tuskegee Airmen met all three. Even decades after the last airman's passing, the places tied to their journey carried an almost sacred presence. Mode Field, once buzzing with cadets and instructors, now stood as a national historic site. Visitors walked toward the old hangars as though approaching a shrine. The sunlit concrete carried echoes of engines that once roared with promise. Inside one hangar, AP-51 Mustang restored to full red tail colors stood on display. It wasn't a combat veteran. The originals had long been lost, scrapped, or scattered, but that hardly mattered. Visitors whispered around it as though standing near a living ancestor. One elderly man walked up slowly and pressed his palm against the polished fuselage. His eyes glistened. "My father chased these planes as a boy," he murmured. "He said they were angels with engine." A child beside him whispered, "Do angels really have engine?" The man smiled gently. "The best ones do." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in Europe, the Red Tail's memory took on a life of its own. In Germany, a retired Luftwaffe historian published a landmark book analyzing encounters between German pilots and the Tuskegee squadron. His research revealed that many German aces respected, and in some cases feared, the discipline of the red-tailed escorts. He wrote, "They did not fly like novices. They flew like men who knew exactly why they were there." A museum in Berlin added an exhibit featuring interviews with German pilots who had survived dogfights with the red-tailed. One recalled, "The ones with the red tails, they were steady. They did not break. They did not chase glory. They protected their bombers like knights around a king." He paused before adding, "They were unlike any other." It was an extraordinary moment, former adversaries acknowledging the excellence of men their own country once dismissed as inferior. History had come full circle, but perhaps the most touching tributes came from Italy. In the quiet countryside where the 332nd Fighter Group had once operated from makeshift airstrips, villagers kept the memory alive in ways both simple and heartfelt. A farmer tending a vineyard near the old Ramitelli field left a small red wooden tail affixed to a post overlooking the valley. When asked why, he shrugged. "My grandfather said the red tails watched over," he explained. "So I watch over them." Children in local schools studied the Tuskegee story as part of their curriculum, not as American history, but as Italian history. They learned the names of pilots who once bought bread from their great-grandparents. They memorized the months the airmen lived on their soil. They spoke of them as though they were neighbors. In one classroom, a teacher asked her students, "Why do we honor the red tails?" A girl raised her hand and replied, "Because they protected our sky." That answer needed no elaboration. As the legacy continued to expand, a powerful cultural movement emerged, one that saw the airmen not just as heroes of the past, but as models for the future. In engineering conferences, presenters spoke of the Tuskegee model, referring to the idea that excellence flourishes when people are evaluated by discipline and performance rather than prejudice. In diversity summits, speakers cited the airmen as proof that talent is squandered when opportunity is restricted. In leadership seminars, instructors used the red tails as examples of how moral courage can influence institutional change. In civil rights discussion, activists framed the airmen as living bridges between wartime valor and the struggle for equality. The red tails had become a universal symbol of earned competence, the idea that ability is proven through action, not allowed through permission. Meanwhile, among aviators, a profound shift occurred. Contemporary pilots began to speak of the red tails as the spiritual ancestors of modern flight, not because of race, not because of combat record, but because the airmen embodied a form of discipline, principled flying that transcended time. A commercial airline captain described it this way: "When I fly, I feel like I'm borrowing the sky." The red tails felt like they belonged to it. In military squadrons, pilots often dedicated their training achievements to the Tuskegee Airmen. First solo flights, first night landings, first carrier qualifications, first combat sorties. They would sign logbooks with a simple inscription. For the red tails, it was a vow of gratitude, quiet and deeply sincere. The airmen's story also continued to shape conversations about identity. Young people wrestling with their sense of belonging in school, in society, in their families, found strength in the airmen's journey. They saw men who had been underestimated, doubted, dismissed, yet who rose above the noise through discipline and courage. One teenager, struggling with anxiety, wrote online, "The red tails told me I don't have to be fearless. I just have to be faithful to my purpose." Another wrote, "I'm trying to be brave in my own way. They show me it's possible." The airmen had become more than historical figures. They had become emotional companions. In time, scholars recognized something extraordinary. The Tuskegee Airmen had reshaped not only the meaning of military heroism, but the meaning of American heroism itself. Traditional narratives focused on victories. The red tails introduced a new kind of story, one rooted in dignity, perseverance, justice, and the ability to excel in a world that expected failure. Their story made heroism ethical, not just tactical. A historian summarized it well. They were fighting for America, but they were also fighting for the idea of America. And in doing so, they made the country more worthy of their sacrifice. And so, as the decades rolled on, The Tuskegee legacy continued to rise, not because of propaganda or sentimentality, but because the world still needed their example. Whenever prejudice tried to define people, their story rose. Whenever doubt clouded ambition, their story rose. Whenever institutions questioned potential, their story rose. Whenever someone felt unseen, unheard, underestimated, the red tails appeared in memory like a beacon. Their legacy had become a flight path for the human spirit. By the time the story reached the present day, something beautiful had happened. The Tuskegee Airmen no longer belonged to history. They belonged to humanity. They were no longer just the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group. They were symbols of what people can become when courage meets opportunity, when discipline meets purpose, when excellence meets injustice head-on and refuses to yield. Their red tails once cut through the sky. Now their legacy cuts through time. And as long as there are people who dream of rising above the world's expectations, the Tuskegee Airmen will continue to rise with them, higher, farther, forever. In the settling calm of the 21st century, as the world wrestled with new challenges, political turmoil, cultural division, technological upheaval, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen emerged again and again like a lighthouse through shifting fog. Whenever discussions arose about equality, courage, leadership, or the human spirit's refusal to break, someone would inevitably mention the red tails, not out of habit, not out of nostalgia, but because their story represented one of the clearest, purest demonstrations of what humanity is capable of when dignity refuses to surrender. Their legacy had become a touchstone, a reminder that the moral universe, however slow, bends toward excellence when excellence refuses to be denied. And yet, even as the airmen's influence grew broader and more abstract, something intimate began happening across the United States. Personal pilgrimages. Every year, thousands of people traveled to Tuskegee, Alabama, not for school trips or formal ceremony, but for themselves. Some arrived alone, some came with family, some traveled across states or across oceans. They walked the halls of the restored hangar, ran their fingers along preserved aircraft skin, and stood quietly on the sun-soaked tarmac where the pilots once marched in formation before flight drills. One young man sat on the edge of the old flight line with a notebook in his lap. When a museum volunteer approached, he explained softly, "My grandfather said he met a Tuskegee Airman once. I wanted to see where they learned to fly, to understand what he meant." Another visitor, an elderly woman leaning on a cane, paused inside hangar to and whispered, "My brother told me about them before he died. He said knowing they were in the sky gave him hope." People came and left in silence, as though stepping into and out of sacred ground. Meanwhile, in the world of aviation technology, drones, hypersonic, autonomous systems, researchers and engineers continued to invoke the red tails as a guiding principle. Test pilots referenced them in pre-flight briefs. Aerospace labs quoted their discipline in Project Charter. Engineers wore red tail pins on their jacket. At a symposium on the ethics of artificial intelligence in warfare, a senior Air Force general concluded his keynote with unexpected sincerity. "Our future may be shaped by machines, but our values were shaped by men like the Tuskegee Airmen. We cannot forget the difference." The audience stood in applause, not for the general, but for the memory of the airmen who had taught the world how to fly with integrity. As historians dug deeper, a new dimension of the airmen's experience began to resonate, the weight of their response. It was not simply that they fought for America. It was that they fought to prove America wrong about its own prejudices. One scholar described it this way: they were qualified to fight a war overseas, but first, they had to win a war at home. This double burden, carried by each pilot and mechanic, created a psychological pressure modern readers could barely fathom. Every mission mattered, not just tactically, but symbolically. Every mistake risked reinforcing a belief that had no basis in truth. Every victory challenged the foundations of a segregated nation. And yet, the airmen did not bend beneath that pressure. They forged it into discipline. More documents surfaced, diaries, letters, mission log, revealing private reflections that had remained hidden for decades. A cadet at Tuskegee wrote in a 1943 journal, "I have decided something. If my country will not honor me, then I will honor myself." A ground crewman wrote, "We cannot afford slop. A white mechanic may be forgiven for an error. We will not be." A pilot wrote the night before shipping overseas, "I am not afraid of dying. I am afraid of being forgotten." Those words, once scribbled in the dark with a shaky hand, echoed across time. They were not forgotten. They became scripture in the book of American courage. The airmen's impact also permeated the artistic world. A sculptor in Chicago created a massive bronze monument of a P-51 thrusting upward at a 45-degree angle, as though eternally climbing. A poet in New York published a collection titled Engines of Red, inspired by the rhythm of propellers and the pulse of disciplined hearts. A photographer produced a series in which modern black aviators posed beside portrait Tuskegee pilot, creating a visual dialogue, past and present. One of the most striking works of art emerged unexpectedly from a high school student in Detroit, a mural stretching 60 feet across the side of a community center. It depicted a young Tuskegee cadet staring into a mirror, but in the reflection, he appeared as a commander in a modern fighter squadron. The mural bore a simple inscription, "See what they saw." Visitors stopped and stared for long minutes. Some cried, some saluted, some simply placed a hand on the wall. Art had become another runway for the Tuskegee legacy. As the years progressed, the stories of individual airmen found new platform. Podcasts chronicled their lives episode by episode. University lectures explored their tactical brilliance. Documentaries dug into their emotional journey. Books examined their post-war struggles, the painful transition from celebrated pilots in Europe to segregated civilians in America. One biography of a navigator who later became a school principal ended with words that touched every reader. He taught children with the same discipline he once used to chart the sky. Another biography described a pilot who, after the war, chose to live quietly as a postal worker. When asked late in life why he never spoke of his service, he said, "The sky was ours. That was enough." These intimate snapshots painted a fuller portrait, not of superheroes, but of men who carried the sky inside them long after they stopped flying. One of the most powerful shifts occurred in the world of military training. Each new generation of cadets, pilots, navigators, mechanics, officers treated the Tuskegee story as foundational. It was not just history, it was a case study in ethics, a model of leadership, a lesson in, a reminder that discipline has moral weight. During a ceremony awarding wings to graduating pilots, an instructor addressed the class. "You carry on your wings the heritage of every aviator who came before you. But there is one group whose spirit you must carry even closer to your heart, the Red Tails. They flew with purpose, with clarity, with humility, with honor. Do the same." The cadets saluted, knowing the charge was not symbolic, it was a duty. And still, even as their influence reached academia, art, policy, and memory, the most profound dimension of the Tuskegee legacy unfolded in the quietest places. A mother told her son he could become anything, because the Red Tails did. A flight instructor encouraged a struggling student by reminding him that even the airmen had failed check ride. A young woman, discouraged by rejection, kept a photo of the Red Tails taped above her desk. "They said we couldn't, we did." A veteran recovering from trauma listened to interviews of Tuskegee pilots speaking frankly about fear, vulnerability, and endurance. He later told a counselor, "If they could carry their fear into the sky, I can carry mine through the day." The airmen lived in these small acts of resolve. They lived wherever someone chose courage over surrender. And as the narrative moved toward its next horizon, one truth grew clearer with every passing year. The Tuskegee Airmen had not merely changed the course of World War II, they had changed the course of human possibility, because their legacy proved something the world desperately needed to remember: that greatness does not require permission, that dignity cannot be denied, that courage can rewrite the rules of history, and that the sky is wide enough for anyone with the heart to ride. Their red tails no longer sliced through European airspace, but their memory soared above every doubt ever cast upon the human spirit. And as long as people looked upward, as long as people dreamed of flight in any form, literal or metaphorical, the Tuskegee Airmen would continue to ascend, carried not by engines, but by the generations who refused to let their legacy fall. They were proving themselves with every mission. But war does not reward excellence, it punishes hesitation. And the Red Tails were about to face the greatest challenge of their lives, one that would test not their skill, but their resolve.